My father-in-law called me a gold digger in front of 11 people at his own dinner table. 40 minutes later, his private bank called him about a wire transfer with my name on it. He didn't know which fact to be angrier about. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here again. If this is your first time listening, welcome, and please take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if you've been here before, you know how much it means to me when you drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. It helps me picture all of you out there, driving home, folding laundry, lying awake. Now let me tell you what happened to me. My name is Renata Castillo. Everyone calls me Ren. I'm 39 years old, and for 9 years I've been married to a man named Ethan Preston, whose family has more money than most small countries and less warmth than a parking garage in January. I grew up in Brunswick, Georgia, in a rented house with a roof that leaked into a bucket every spring, raised by a mother who worked doubles at a diner and a father who left before I could remember his voice. I put myself through college waiting tables at a seafood place on the coast, wearing an apron that smelled permanently of fryer oil, saving every tip in a coffee can I kept under my bed because I didn't trust banks yet, not really, not after watching my mother get overdraft fees she couldn't afford. That was my inheritance. A coffee can and a stubborn refusal to ever again feel as small as poverty had made me feel. Ethan and I met at a conference in Atlanta 11 years ago. He was quiet in a room full of loud men, the kind of quiet that made you look twice. He didn't mention his family's name for 3 months, and when he finally did, I had to look it up, because I genuinely didn't know that Preston Maritime Holdings was a shipping empire that touched 4 continents and employed thousands of people who would never once meet the man whose name was on the building. I built a small graphic design and branding studio of my own during those same years, slowly, unglamorously, out of a spare bedroom and then a rented office above a bakery, and by the time Ethan and I married, I had 11 employees and clients who paid me because my work was good, not because of who I'd married into. None of that mattered to Harold Preston. Harold is Ethan's father, 71 years old, a man who built his fortune from a single tugboat his own father left him and who has never, not once in 9 years, looked at me without a flicker of calculation behind his eyes, like he was still waiting to catch me doing what he'd already decided I was there to do. He remarried 5 years ago, 18 months after Ethan's mother died of ovarian cancer, to a woman named Vivian, 44, blonde, sharp-jawed, always perfectly assembled, who slid into the family with the practiced ease of someone who had done this kind of sliding before. Vivian was warm to Harold's face and cool to mine in the particular way certain women are cool to other women they've decided are competition, even when there's nothing to compete over. I noticed it early. I filed it away and told myself I was imagining things, the way you do when you want peace more than you want to be right. The Preston family dinners happened once a month at Harold's house on the Isle of Hope, a white colonial with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides and looked out over marsh grass turning gold in the evening light. I dreaded them the way you dread a dentist appointment you can't reschedule, a low, steady hum of anxiety that started Sunday morning and didn't lift until we were back in the car driving home. Harold had a habit of asking me pointed questions about money at these dinners, disguised as curiosity. "How's the studio doing, Renata? Still in that little office above the bakery? Ethan tells me you took out a business loan last year. Everything all right with that?" I answered honestly every time, because I had nothing to hide, and every time I watched something in his face that told me my honesty hadn't changed his mind about anything. What I didn't know, walking into that house on the second Sunday of October, was that Vivian had spent the previous 3 weeks feeding Harold a story. A story built carefully, the way a good story is always built, out of just enough truth to make the lie inside it feel solid. She'd told him that Ethan had come to her, in confidence, worried, saying that Renata had been asking him for money behind his back, quietly, urgently, more than once, and that he didn't know how to tell his father. None of it was true. Ethan had said nothing of the kind to anyone, because there was nothing to say. But Vivian had learned, in whatever life had taught her the skills she carried into ours, that the fastest way to move suspicion away from yourself is to plant it firmly on someone else, and that grief-softened old men with fortunes to protect make excellent, willing gardens for that kind of planting. I walked into that dinner in a green dress I'd bought for my mother's memorial service 2 years earlier, carrying a bottle of wine I'd chosen carefully, the way I always did, wanting so badly, still, after 9 years, to be liked by a man who had already decided I never would be. I had no idea that the evening had already been arranged around me like furniture around a stage. I had no idea that somewhere in a downtown Savannah office building, a private banker named Desmond Achebe had, 3 days earlier, flagged an irregular transfer request originating from an account linked to Harold Preston's personal trust, a transfer request that listed, as its receiving beneficiary, an account bearing my name. I had no idea any of that yet. I only knew that Harold looked at me differently the moment I walked through his front door, and that the marsh outside his window was turning the particular gold it turns right before the light goes. Dinner started the way it always did. Harold at the head of the table, Vivian at his right hand, Ethan and I across from his younger sister Colette and her husband, a rotating cast of cousins and family friends filling the rest of the chairs, candles Vivian had chosen for their scent rather than their light, so the whole room smelled faintly of vanilla and something more expensive I could never name. I complimented the roast. Vivian smiled at me in that practiced, cool way and said thank you, as though she had made it herself, though I knew for a fact her housekeeper had. Harold poured wine for everyone but me, then caught himself and apologized with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Small things. The kind of small things you learn, in a family like that, not to mention out loud, because mentioning them makes you the problem. It was over dessert that it happened. Colette had asked, innocently enough, how the studio was doing, and I'd mentioned, proudly, that we'd just signed a contract with a regional grocery chain to redesign their packaging across 40 product lines, real money, the kind of contract that would let me finally hire a junior designer I'd been wanting for a year. Harold set his fork down. I remember the sound of it against the china, deliberate, too loud for the size of the motion. Funny, he said, that you need more money. Ethan mentioned you'd been asking him for some. I felt the table go quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when everyone already knows what's about to happen except the person it's about to happen to. I looked at Ethan. Ethan looked confused, genuinely confused, the kind of confusion you can't fake, and said, Dad, I never said that, I don't know where you heard that. Harold didn't look at his son. He looked at me. Come on, Renata, he said, his voice pleasant, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Let's not pretend. You came from nothing. You married into this family and within a year you had a business loan and a new office and now a bigger contract than you can apparently afford to staff without asking my son for cash on the side. I've watched women do this before. I know what it looks like when it's happening in my own house. The word he used next, he said quietly, almost kindly, the way you'd deliver bad medical news. Gold digger. He said it and then he picked his fork back up and resumed eating his tiramisu as though he had simply stated a fact about the weather. Nobody at that table defended me except Ethan, whose voice shook with an anger I'd never heard from him before, and Colette, who reached under the table and squeezed my hand once, hard, without looking at me. Vivian said nothing at all. She sipped her wine and watched me over the rim of the glass with an expression I would spend the following weeks understanding fully for the first time. I didn't cry at that table. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the crying to come immediately, and it doesn't always. What came immediately was a strange, cold clarity, the kind that arrives when your body decides it doesn't have the luxury of falling apart yet. I set my napkin down, thanked Vivian for dinner in a voice I didn't recognize as my own, and told Ethan I needed some air. I stood on that wraparound porch and looked at the marsh going from gold to gray as the sun dropped, and I thought about the coffee can under my childhood bed, and I thought, quietly, almost peacefully, that Harold Preston had no idea what I had survived to get to a place where his opinion of me could even reach me, and that whatever this was, whatever ugly current had just moved through that dining room, I intended to find out exactly where it started. Ethan came out 10 minutes later and found me still standing there. He didn't apologize for his father, because he knew, correctly, that it wasn't his apology to give. Instead he said something I've held on to since. He said, I don't know where he got that idea, Ren, but I know it isn't true, and I know you, and I am not going to let this go until I understand where it came from. We drove home mostly in silence, the kind of silence two people share when they are both turning the same evening over and over, examining it from different angles, looking for the scene where the lie had been sewn in. I remember looking out the window at the dark shapes of live oaks passing by, draped in Spanish moss, and feeling, for the first time in 9 years of marriage, that something in that family was not simply cold. It was engineered. My phone rang at 9:40 that night, 40 minutes after we'd walked through our own front door. It was Harold's number. I almost didn't answer it, still raw from the dinner table, but something in me, the same something that had once counted coins from a coffee can and refused to be small, told me to pick up. His voice was different than it had been over dessert. Thinner. "Renata," he said, and there was a pause before he continued, a pause I would later understand was the sound of a proud man forcing himself to ask a question he didn't want to ask. "I need to know something, and I need you to tell me the truth. My bank just called me. They're asking about a transfer request with your name on it. $2.4 million. Do you know anything about that?" I sat down slowly on the edge of our bed. I told him, honestly, that I knew nothing about any transfer, that I had no account he wasn't already aware of, that the last time I'd checked, my business accounts and our joint household account were the only banking relationships in my name in the state of Georgia. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him breathing, and I understood, in that silence, that some part of him wanted very badly to believe I was lying, because believing I was lying would make sense of the story he'd already built about me at that dinner table. "Send me whatever information the bank gave you," I said. "I want to see it myself." He said he would have his banker email it in the morning, and then, almost as an afterthought, in a voice that had lost all of its earlier certainty, he said, "I'll admit, this is strange timing, given what I said tonight." I didn't dignify that with the reply it deserved. I simply said goodnight and hung up. I didn't sleep. I lay next to Ethan in the dark and stared at the ceiling fan turning its slow circles and thought about every small, cold interaction I'd ever had with Vivian over 5 years, replaying them now with new eyes, the way you replay an old photograph after someone tells you the person standing at the edge of the frame was never who you thought they were. I thought about the way she always seemed to know things about the family's finances before Ethan did, the way she'd casually mention, at holidays, some new investment Harold had made, watching our faces for reactions. I thought about the time, 2 years earlier, when she'd asked me, seemingly out of nowhere, what bank I used for my studio's business accounts, and I'd told her, because why wouldn't I, and she'd smiled and said, "Oh, I just always find it interesting how people organize their money," and moved on to another topic before I could think twice about the question. The email from Desmond Achebe, Harold's private banker at Coastal Heritage Trust, arrived at 7 the next morning. Ethan and I read it together at our kitchen table, coffee going cold in front of us. It laid out, in the careful, hedged language of a man who knew he was one wrong word away from a lawsuit, that a wire transfer request in the amount of $2.4 million had been submitted 3 days earlier through the online portal attached to Harold Preston's personal trust account, authorized with credentials that appeared valid, and that the receiving account, opened 4 months prior at a regional bank in Charleston, was registered to a Renata Castillo Preston, with a home address that was not mine, a phone number that was not mine, and a social security number that, when the bank's fraud department cross-referenced it that morning, did not match mine at all. Someone had built a version of me. A hollow one, with my name stitched onto it like a mask, and had tried to walk $2.4 million straight through the door wearing my face. The transfer had been flagged and frozen automatically, the bank's algorithms catching an inconsistency between the account's stated purpose and its transaction pattern, which was, frankly, the only reason any of us knew about it at all before the money vanished completely. If it hadn't been flagged, I understood with a kind of nauseated clarity, sitting there at my own kitchen table, the money would simply have moved, and Harold would have discovered the theft weeks or months later, and the paper trail waiting for him would have led, cleanly, deliberately, directly to my name. I would have been the woman who married into money and then, for years later, tried to steal more of it. It was, I realized, staring at that email, an almost elegant piece of architecture. Someone had built me a very convincing coffin and was simply waiting for the right moment to lower me into it. Ethan wanted to call his father immediately and confront him about the dinner, about the timing, about everything, but I asked him to wait. I have spent my whole life being underestimated by people who assumed my modest beginnings meant a modest mind, and there is a particular kind of patience you develop when you've had to prove yourself in rooms that didn't want you there, a patience that teaches you not to move until you understand exactly what you're moving against. I told Ethan I wanted to hire someone. Not a lawyer yet. A forensic accountant, someone who could look at whatever paper trail existed and tell us, with numbers instead of suspicion, exactly what had happened and who had built it. He didn't argue with me. He simply nodded, and something in his face told me he already suspected, the way I suspected, where this particular road was going to end. Her name was Grace Oduya, and Ethan's college roommate, now a corporate attorney in Atlanta, recommended her within an hour of being asked. Grace had spent 14 years unwinding financial fraud for insurance companies and estates before going independent, and when I called her that afternoon and explained what had happened, she asked exactly 4 questions, all of them precise, none of them wasted, and then said she could start the following Monday if I could get her access to the flagged account documentation and, ideally, 5 years of Harold's trust statements. 5 years felt like an enormous request to make of a man who, less than 24 hours earlier, had called me a gold digger over tiramisu, but I called him anyway. I told him what Grace had found so far, that the social security number didn't match mine, that someone had built a fraudulent identity wearing my name, and I asked him, directly, for the statements. There was a long silence on the line. Then he said, quietly, "Get me her number. I want her looking at everything." Grace worked out of a rented conference room in Savannah for the better part of 3 weeks, and I sat in on most of those sessions, watching her build a timeline the way a mason builds a wall, one small verified fact laid carefully on top of the last. She started with the fraudulent account in Charleston and traced its opening documents backward, and what she found first was almost too clumsy to be believed, until you remembered that most people who steal successfully for a long time eventually grow careless, certain of their own invisibility. The application for that account had been submitted using a notarized copy of my driver's license, except the notary's stamp, when Grace enlarged it on her monitor, belonged to a small notary office in a strip mall outside Charleston that, according to the state's licensing board, had closed down 11 months before the document was supposedly stamped. Someone had forged a forgery and hadn't even bothered to check whether their fake notary still existed. The deeper thread, the one that took Grace 2 full weeks to fully untangle, ran through Harold's trust itself, 5 years of statements that told a story far larger and far older than one fraudulent Charleston account. Small transfers, unremarkable on their own, 3,000 here, 6,000 there, routed out of the trust's operating account and into a shell company called Coastal Meridian Consulting, registered in Delaware, whose sole listed officer was a woman named V. Ashcroft, which meant nothing to any of us until Grace pulled the company's original incorporation documents from 4 years earlier and we saw, listed as the registered agent's contact email, an address that began with the letters Preston, an email account that had clearly been Vivian's before her second marriage folded her maiden name into Harold's. I sat very still when Grace showed us that document. Ethan, sitting beside me, made a sound I'd never heard him make before, something between a laugh and a cough, disbelief trying to find an exit. Grace, who had done this work long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything, simply kept talking, walking us through the total. Over 5 years, in transfers dressed up as consulting fees, investment management costs, and 2 supposed emergency loans to a fictional Preston cousin who, as far as any of us could determine, did not exist, Vivian had moved just over $3.1 million out of Harold's trust and into accounts that traced, eventually, entirely back to her. And the fraudulent account in my name, the one holding $2.4 million that had never quite made it to its destination, wasn't a separate scheme at all. It was the exit. Grace believed, and later proved, that Vivian had grown afraid the slow leak was becoming visible in the trust's quarterly reviews, and had built one final, larger transfer, disguised with my identity, so that if anyone eventually noticed the pattern of missing money, the trail would point away from her and directly at the daughter-in-law who'd never quite belonged. It explained everything, once we could see the whole shape of it laid out on Grace's conference table. It explained the question about my business bank 2 years earlier, casual and curious, filed away and used later. It explained the story she'd fed Harold about me asking Ethan for money, planted 3 weeks before that dinner, timed, Grace pointed out, almost exactly to when the fraudulent Charleston account had first been opened, as though Vivian had been laying 2 fires at once, one to frame me socially within the family and one to frame me financially within the bank, so that by the time anyone went looking for a thief, the story would already be written before the facts arrived to confirm it. It explained, too, the particular coolness in her eyes at every family dinner for 5 years, not jealousy exactly, but the wary vigilance of someone perpetually managing a long con, watching the one person in the room sharp enough to eventually notice the seams. I want to tell you honestly what I felt, sitting in that conference room with the evidence laid out in front of me like a body on a table. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, mostly, a strange grief for Harold, a man who had spent 5 years married to a woman quietly hollowing out everything he'd built, while directing his suspicion at the one person in his family who had never taken a dollar from him she hadn't earned. Ethan reached over and took my hand under the table, and Grace, closing her laptop, said something I've never forgotten. She said, in my experience, the people who scream loudest about being taken advantage of are very often standing directly next to the person actually doing it, and simply looking the wrong way. We didn't go to Harold with rumors or suspicion. Grace insisted, correctly, that we build the case completely before showing him anything, because a man like Harold Preston, confronted with an incomplete accusation against his wife, would defend her out of pride before he'd examine the evidence, and we would lose whatever narrow window we had. So we waited 2 more weeks while Grace finished tracing the last of the shell company's transactions and prepared a report clean enough, she said, to hand directly to a prosecutor without changing a word. During those 2 weeks, I saw Vivian exactly once, at a charity gala Harold had insisted we all attend for appearances, and she smiled at me across the room in that same cool, practiced way she always had, having absolutely no idea that I now knew the precise shape and dollar amount of every lie she had built her second marriage on top of. We asked Harold to meet us at Grace's office on a Thursday afternoon, telling him only that the investigation into the fraudulent account had produced conclusive findings and that he needed to hear them in person. He arrived alone, in a gray suit that suddenly looked too large on him, as though the last month had cost him weight he couldn't afford to lose. He sat across from Grace, with Ethan and me on either side of him, and I watched a man who had spent his entire adult life being the most powerful person in every room he entered brace himself, for the first time in longer than I could guess, for a room he did not control. Grace was gentle with him in a way I hadn't expected from someone so precise. She started with the small transfers, the shell company, the timeline, laying each document in front of him slowly enough that he could absorb it, watching his face change by degrees, the particular gray that comes over a person when disbelief finally loses its argument with the evidence. He didn't say anything for a long time after Grace finished. He simply sat there, staring at the incorporation papers for Coastal Meridian Consulting, at the email address with his wife's maiden name folded into it, at 5 years of his own trust statements annotated in Grace's careful red ink showing exactly where the bleeding had started and never stopped. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. He asked Grace, very quietly, if there was any possibility of a mistake. Grace, without cruelty, told him no, that she had cross-referenced every transfer against banking records, notary registrations, and IP login data from the trust's online portal, all of which placed the access consistently to a single device registered under Vivian's name. Harold closed his eyes. Then he looked at me, and I watched something move across his face that I had waited 5 years to see and had genuinely stopped believing I ever would. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that, at first, 2 words that seemed to cost him more than the $3.1 million sitting at the center of the report between us. Then more, haltingly, the words of a man unaccustomed to apologizing to anyone, let alone a daughter-in-law he'd humiliated at his own dinner table 3 weeks earlier. "I said that thing about you," he said, and I believed it, because it was easier to believe than admitting I'd let someone into my house I should have questioned years ago. I was so afraid of being an old fool taken advantage of again that I became exactly that, just aimed at the wrong person. I sat with that for a moment before I answered him, because I had spent 3 weeks deciding what I would say if this moment ever came, and I found, when it finally arrived, that I didn't want revenge in my voice. I wanted the truth in it. I told him that I had never once, in 9 years, asked his family for anything, that I had built my own business from a coffee can under a childhood bed, and that the only thing I had ever wanted from him was to be seen clearly, and that clearly, apparently, had taken a forensic accountant and $3.1 million to finally happen. He didn't confront Vivian alone. He asked Ethan and me to be there, which surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened, and Grace came as well, along with a criminal attorney Harold's own lawyer had recommended once the scope of the fraud became clear enough to require one. We met at the house on the Isle of Hope, the same dining room, the same wraparound porch, the marsh outside gone dull green in the flat light of a Thursday afternoon instead of gold. Vivian came downstairs expecting, I think, an ordinary Thursday, and I watched her face when she saw the 4 of us seated at that table with a folder in front of Harold's attorney, watched the practiced warmth drop away all at once like a coat sliding off a hook, revealing, underneath, something colder and far more calculating than I had ever let myself fully believe was there. She denied it for exactly 4 minutes, calmly, methodically, the same skill she'd used to build the story about me now turned toward unbuilding the story about herself. She stopped denying it the moment Harold's attorney read the notary's closure date aloud, the detail so small and so damning that no explanation could survive it. After that, she said very little. She looked at Harold for a long moment, and whatever passed between them in that look was theirs, not mine to describe, though I will say that whatever love had existed in that marriage seemed, in that instant, to fold in on itself completely, revealing the transaction that had been living underneath it for 5 years. She looked at me last, the way Patricia had looked at Carol in a story I'd once heard, composed even now, even caught, and I felt no satisfaction in that look. I felt, mostly, tired, and ready for it to be over. The legal process that followed moved faster than any of us expected, largely because Grace's report was, as she'd promised, prosecutor ready from the first day. Vivian's attorney negotiated a plea rather than risk trial, given the strength of the paper trail, and she was ordered to make full restitution of the $3.1 million, plus an additional $400,000 in penalties and legal costs, and to serve 18 months, most of it eventually reduced through cooperation and a clean prior record to home confinement, a sentence I understood, even at the time, as far lighter than what she had actually done, though Grace reminded me gently that financial fraud rarely receives the weight of the damage it causes, and that the money returning intact to Harold's trust mattered more, in practical terms, than any number of months served. The frozen $2.4 million transfer, the one that had been built wearing my stolen identity, was fully reversed and returned to the trust within 6 weeks, and the fraudulent Charleston account, along with every document bearing a version of my name I had never authorized, was formally expunged from every registry that had ever recorded it. Harold's divorce from Vivian was finalized within 4 months, quietly, without the public spectacle his lawyers had initially feared, mostly because Vivian, facing criminal restitution on top of a contested divorce, had no appetite left for a drawn-out fight over a prenuptial agreement that had, ironically, been drafted so tightly in Harold's favor that there was very little left for her to contest. She moved to a condominium outside Charleston, not far, I noted with a kind of grim irony, from the bank where she'd opened the account that had finally unraveled everything, and as far as I know, has not spoken to anyone in the Preston family since the day she walked out of that dining room. I think about her sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of clinical curiosity, the way you think about whether that has passed. I wonder what it costs a person to build a life that elaborate on top of a lie, and whether, somewhere underneath all that careful architecture, there was ever a version of her that wanted something simpler and didn't know how to ask for it honestly. Harold changed in ways I hadn't expected and, honestly, hadn't asked for. He started calling me directly instead of routing every conversation through Ethan, small calls at first, awkward ones, asking about the studio, actually listening to the answers this time instead of using the question as a door into suspicion. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, he asked if he could come see my office, the one above the bakery he'd once implied I couldn't really afford, and he stood in the middle of our design floor for a long time, looking at the mood boards and the packaging mock-ups pinned to the walls, at 11 employees who had built careers there because I'd hired them and trained them and fought for every contract that paid their salaries, and he said, quietly, I had no idea how much you'd actually built. I didn't say anything clever back to him. I just said thank you for coming to see it, and I meant it more than I expected to. The dinners changed too, once they started again, which they did, slowly, a few months after everything settled. Harold cooks now, occasionally, badly, with a determination that makes the badness almost endearing, and the pointed money questions have stopped entirely, replaced by an odd, halting curiosity about my life that I think is his way of trying to make up, in small increments, for 5 years of assuming the worst about me before he'd bothered to ask a single honest question. I don't think a man like Harold Preston fully rebuilds himself at 71. I think he simply becomes a slightly more careful version of who he already was, and I've decided that a slightly more careful version, offered honestly, is worth more to me than an apology performed once and never lived out afterward. Grace Oduya still calls occasionally, mostly to check in, though I think also because the case became, in her words, one of the strangest and most satisfying of her career, a fraud built to frame an innocent woman that instead exposed the actual thief through nothing more than one lazy, unchecked notary stamp. She told me once, over coffee, that in 14 years of this work, the cases that stay with her are never the biggest dollar amounts. They're the ones where someone tried to make an innocent person carry the weight of someone else's theft, and failed, because the truth, given enough patient digging, tends to insist on being found. I think about that sentence often. I think it's the truest thing anyone said to me during the entire ordeal. As for the studio, the grocery chain contract closed exactly as planned, and I did hire that junior designer I'd been wanting, a 24-year-old named Priya who reminds me, some mornings, of myself at that age, hungry and underestimated and quietly certain she has more to offer than anyone around her has yet bothered to notice. We've grown to 19 employees now, out of that same office above the bakery, though we're outgrowing it, and Ethan and I have started looking at a larger space downtown, something with room to expand, something entirely mine, built on money I earned one client at a time, starting with a coffee can under a bed in a house with a roof that leaked every spring. I think about that coffee can often, actually, more now than I did before any of this happened. I kept it, all these years, packed away in a box in our attic, empty now, dented at one corner, faded label barely legible. I brought it down not long ago and set it on my desk at the studio, where I can see it while I work, not as a reminder of poverty, exactly, but as a reminder of a particular kind of stubbornness, the stubbornness of a girl who decided, very young, that she would never let anyone else's assumptions about her become the whole story of her life. Harold Preston looked at me across a dinner table and decided, based on nothing but the accident of where I was born, that he knew exactly what kind of woman I was. He was wrong, and it took a forensic accountant, a fraudulent notary stamp, and a very lazy thief to prove it, but he was wrong, and I think some part of him will carry the memory of being wrong for the rest of his life, the way you carry the memory of a wound that healed but left a mark you can still find if you know where to look. Ethan and I sat on that same wraparound porch a few weeks ago, the marsh going gold the way it does at that particular hour, and he asked me if I still thought about that dinner, the word Harold had used, the silence of everyone at that table who hadn't defended me. I told him the truth, which is that I think about it less than I expected to, because the story ended up so much bigger than the insult that started it, and because I've learned, at 39, after everything, that the people who call you a name they've decided fits you are very often the ones with the least accurate sense of who is actually sitting across from them. I finished my wine. The light kept fading over the water, gold turning slowly to gray the way it always does, and for the first time in 9 years, sitting in that particular chair on that particular porch, I felt something close to peace, earned the long way, the only way I've ever known how to earn anything. I drove down to Brunswick not long after everything was settled, back to the street where I grew up, though the house itself was gone now, replaced by a newer one with vinyl siding and a driveway where our rutted dirt path used to be. I sat in my car across the street for longer than I probably needed to, looking at where that leaking roof used to be, thinking about my mother, who died 6 years ago without ever meeting Ethan, without ever seeing what became of the daughter she raised on double shifts and diner tips. I think about what she would have said if she could have seen that dining room table on the Isle of Hope, the candles, the tiramisu, a man with more money than she'd earned in a lifetime looking at her daughter and deciding, on no evidence at all, that she was there to take something rather than build something. I think she would have laughed, actually, the particular laugh she saved for people who mistook exhaustion for weakness, and then she would have told me, the way she told me 100 times growing up, that the people who assume the worst about you are usually the ones who have never had to earn anything the hard way themselves, and don't know what it looks like when someone finally does. The plea hearing for Vivian happened on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom that felt smaller and more ordinary than I had somehow expected, given the size of everything that had led us there. I sat 2 rows behind Harold, with Ethan beside me, and watched a woman I had once shared 11 Thanksgivings with stand at a podium and admit, in careful, lawyer-vetted language, to 5 years of systematic fraud against her own husband's family trust. She never turned around to look at either of us. I don't know what I expected to feel, watching that, some kind of vindication I'd been carrying without fully naming it, but what actually settled over me, sitting in that courtroom, was something closer to exhaustion finally allowed to rest. It was over. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but over, in the specific, structural way that a courtroom makes things over, with dates and restitution schedules and a judge's signature that closes a door you'd spent months prying open. Grace's final report, the one she submitted to close out the engagement, included a line I asked her to let me keep a copy of, separate from the formal findings, because it said something I wanted to remember. She'd written that the case demonstrated, in her professional opinion, that the person most aggressively accused within a family system is very often not the perpetrator but the most convenient available target, someone whose outsider status makes them easy to suspect and hard to defend, and that recognizing this pattern early, rather than assuming guilt follows suspicion, would have saved the Preston family a great deal of money and a great deal of pain. I read that line more than once, sitting alone in my office one evening after everyone else had gone home, the coffee can catching the last of the daylight on my desk, and I thought about how much of my life, long before Harold Preston ever sat across a dinner table from me, had been spent being underestimated in exactly that way, assumed guilty of ambition simply for having grown up without money and refusing to stay that way. Ethan has been different too, in a manner I didn't fully expect. He'd always been a quiet man, steady in the particular way that used to comfort me and occasionally, if I'm honest, used to frustrate me, because steadiness can sometimes look like avoidance when a family needs someone to actually stand up and say a hard thing out loud. But something shifted in him the night his father called that word across a dinner table, something that hardened into a resolve I hadn't seen from him before, and he carried that resolve through every meeting with Grace, every uncomfortable conversation with his father, every moment where the easier path would have been silence. He told me once, late at night, not long after Vivian's sentencing, that watching his father almost let a lie define me the way it nearly had made him understand, for the first time, how much silence had cost his own mother during her marriage, how many small accusations and cold appraisals she had likely absorbed without anyone in that family ever standing up the way he finally had for me. I didn't know what to say to that. I just held his hand and let the porch go quiet around us. The studio move happened in the spring. We signed a lease on a converted warehouse space downtown, exposed brick, high windows that flood the design floor with morning light, room enough to grow to 30 employees within a few years if the pace we're on continues. Priya designed the new signage herself, her first solo project, and I watched her stand across the street the morning it went up, arms crossed, chewing her lip the way I remember chewing mine at client meetings a decade ago, terrified someone would discover she didn't belong there, not yet understanding that belonging isn't discovered, it's built, slowly, the same way everything worth having is built. I told her that, standing beside her on that sidewalk, and she looked at me like I'd handed her something she'd remember for a long time, the way certain sentences land only when they arrive at exactly the moment you need them. Harold came to the opening. He stood in the middle of that warehouse floor in a suit that fit him properly again, having regained, over the months, some of the weight and some of the certainty the whole ordeal had briefly stripped from him, and he raised a glass, at Ethan's quiet urging, and said a few words to the small crowd of employees and clients we'd invited, Words about resilience and about being wrong and about the particular kind of humility it takes for an old man to admit, in front of people who once watched him fail publicly, that he had misjudged the person standing in front of him. It wasn't a perfect speech. It was a little stiff, a little formal, exactly the kind of speech you'd expect from a man who'd spent 71 years being right and was still learning, late, how to be wrong out loud. But I watched him give it, and I thought about the marsh outside his dining room window, gold in the evening light, and I thought about how far a family can travel, sometimes, from one terrible sentence spoken over dessert to a warehouse full of people applauding something I built with my own hands, and I decided, standing there, that I didn't need his apology to have been perfect. I only needed it to be true, and it was. The coffee can still sits on my desk. I've thought, more than once, about finally throwing it away now that everything has settled, now that the studio has grown large enough that it hardly makes sense as a symbol of scarcity anymore. But I keep deciding against it, because I don't think it was ever really about scarcity at all. I think it was about the particular kind of proof a person needs to carry with them when the world keeps insisting they don't belong somewhere they've clearly earned. Harold Preston called me a gold digger at his own dinner table, and 40 minutes later his bank called about a fortune someone had tried to steal wearing my name, and somewhere between that accusation and that phone call, the truth finally caught up to both of us, slower than I would have liked, but complete, and mine, the way very few things in that family had ever fully felt like mine before. Some evenings, when the studio empties out and the last of the light is coming through those tall warehouse windows the way it used to come through my mother's kitchen window on the good afternoons, I think about how easily this could have gone the other way. If that fraud algorithm hadn't flagged the transfer. If Harold had trusted his suspicion over his son's certainty. If I had been a slightly less stubborn woman, the kind willing to let a family close ranks around a comfortable lie rather than dig, patiently, for an uncomfortable truth. I don't say any of this to sound braver than I was. There were nights during those weeks with Grace when I sat in my car in our driveway before going inside, unable to shake the fear that none of it would matter, that some families protect their own no matter what the evidence says, and that I would simply become, permanently, the woman they'd decided to believe the worst about. That fear never fully left. It just eventually had less and less evidence to feed on. What I've come to understand, in the time since, is that being underestimated is not actually a weakness, not if you refuse to let it become one. It is, if you let it, a kind of quiet training, a slow accumulation of proof you carry with you into rooms that don't expect much from you, proof that outlasts any single dinner, any single accusation, any single cold appraisal from a man convinced he already knows your whole story before you've had the chance to tell it. Harold knows my whole story now. Not the version Vivian built for him out of convenient suspicion, but the real one, coffee can and all, built one client, one flagged transaction, one uncomfortable truth at a time. And when I sit on that porch now, watching the marsh turn gold the way it always does at that particular hour, I don't feel like a woman who survived an accusation. I feel like a woman who was finally, fully seen, and who intends to stay exactly that visible for whatever comes next.